Hi, everyone. My name is Ala Marchenko, and I'm the Executive Co-Director and President of the Aurora Philosophy Institute. It is my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Sherman Balogh, who is very well known to the members of the Tuesday Philosophy Club and has given many interesting talks to us in the past. He is the winner of the Hamlet Cup for the year 2021, which is awarded for the most views on YouTube in a calendar year. His presentation on the critical realism of Bernard Lonergan had 2.2K views. The runner-up was Graham Hubbs with 1K views for Elizabeth Lonergan, or Elizabeth Anscombe, part 1. Over to you, Sherman. Good luck in defending the trophy for 2022.
All right, thank you very much. All right, good evening, everyone. And tonight's presentation is George Grant and the Technological Society. So tonight, we will go through the following points. We'll begin with our introduction, which will include a chronology of George Grant's life. We will look at a particular quandary of George Grant's, and then we'll have a brief outline of the Canadian artist, Alex Colville. Part 1 will consist of George Grant and the Western tradition. Part 2 will deal with Hegelian optimism and a reassessment of technology. Part 3 will look at the Canadian ontological experience. Part 4 will answer this question: what is worth doing in the midst of this barren twilight? And then the slides will include the awards that Grant received, a bibliography, and there's a summary. So everyone, let's begin. So George Grant was born in Toronto in 1918. In 1936, he graduated from Upper Canada College and then entered Queen's University. In 1939, he won a Rhodes Scholarship and was enrolled in law at Oxford University. 1940, he was an air raid precaution officer in a suburb of London. In December 1941, after a period of deep despair, Grant came to the realization that God existed and that there was an order beyond space and time. In 1942, he returned to Canada. At the end of the war, he returned to Oxford, and this time he was to pursue his Doctor of Philosophy in Theology. In 1947, he married Sheila Allen, and eventually the two of them had 6 children. He began teaching in 1947 at Dalhousie University. In 1949, he returned to England to finish his Doctor of Philosophy, and in 1950, he was awarded his degree. In 1960, he accepted and then resigned a position at York University. In 1961, he was appointed to the Department of Religious Studies at McMaster University. And from 64 to 67, he presided as chairman of the Department of Religious Studies. In 1980, he resigned from McMaster and then was appointed Killam Professor at Dalhousie University. In 1984, he retired from Dalhousie, and on September 27, 1988, he died in Halifax. So this is George Grant's quandary. According to Arthur Davis, George Grant from the 1950s to the 1980s was preoccupied with this question. How can we accept the modern discovery that we are free to shape nature and ourselves without forsaking the insight of the older moral and political tradition? We are shaped or fitted for justice, which does not depend on our will. So we can rephrase this question in this manner. Is it possible to live a life of justice as defined by Plato in a technological society? Or we can state it this way. How is it possible to think about the transcendental good in an era when that conception has been put into darkness? Alex Colville, a conceptual artist, was an admirer of George Grant's work. And so during the early 1960s, Colville was commissioned to design the centennial coins for Canada's centennial celebration. Well, the 50-cent piece was dedicated to George Grant. In a letter Alex Colville wrote to Grant, he stated that the concept of the design has some relation to your outlook. Later in this presentation, we will return to Colville, but we should say that he read deeply into existentialist philosophy. He read into Sartre, Camus, and Heidegger, and he was well read in the works of Joseph Conrad, Hannah Arendt, and Thomas Mann. So let's begin with George Grant and the Western tradition. Word war philosophy, according to Grant, comes from two Greek words, love and wisdom. Philosophy means the love of wisdom. Yet philosophy is a desire to seek that which will give purpose and meaning and unity to life. In other words, philosophy begins when we ask the questions, how shall I live? What is life for? Why do I exist in the world? Grant also stated, philosophy is the attempt to fathom that profundity, the mystery of existence. That is, to find the wisdom which will enable us to live as we ought. Here we have a picture of University Hall at McMaster University in 1959. This was the building where George Grant would spend almost 20 years teaching. He would enter this building in 1961. If you look at the architectural style of this building, it's referred to as a neo-Gothic or collegiate Gothic style. The style was to produce a spiritually elevating experience. It was to invoke a sense of historical continuity and scholastic behavior. Well, George Grant, as was noted before, believed in God. He was a Christian. He was a member of United Church, but in March of 1956 in Halifax, Grant and his wife were admitted into the Anglican Church. So religion was a very important part of his worldview. Grant stated, anybody whose life is given over to philosophy needs to read the 13th chapter of the 1 Corinthians. Anybody is open to love, and that is the supreme act. As I have said, faith is the experience that the intelligence is illuminated by love. I mean by love, attention to otherness, receptivity to otherness, and consent to otherness. So if we look at the Corinthians, we'll read, love is patient, love is kind. It is not jealous, love is not pompous, it is not inflated, it is not rude, it does not seek its own interests. So the point to be taken from this is that Grant believed that philosophy should be subservient to religion. Grant highly admired the dialogues of Plato. So Grant wrote, what I find most perfect in Plato is that there is a total union in his thought of what is not in lesser philosophers, either separated or part of which is not present. That is, he combines in a staggering unity the cosmological approach with the ethical religious approach. So Grant would consider these questions cosmological questions. What is the nature of the universe? What is real? How can I know what is real? And ethical religious questions. How shall I live? What is worth doing? What shall I owe my allegiance, my reverence? How shall I find happiness? So here we have an edition of Plato's Republic, translated by Alan Bloom. Alan Bloom used to teach at the University of Toronto, and he later moved on to the University of Chicago. Well, Alan Bloom and George Grant were very good friends. Grant would often write in his book that justice is what we are fitted for. So let's turn to Plato to see what exactly Grant means. Plato wrote, didn't we agree that justice is virtue of soul and injustice vice? Then the just soul and the just man will have a good life, and the unjust man a bad one. Then the just man is happy and the unjust man wretched. Well, then how can one be just or happy, and how can one be unjust or wretched? So let's return to Plato. In the first place, each of us is naturally not quite like anyone else, but rather differs in his nature. Different men are after the accomplishment of different jobs. So on this basis, each thing becomes more plentiful, finer, easier, when one man exempt from other tasks does one thing according to nature. So perhaps one person who did something very well according to his nature was Maurice Rocket Richard. And here we have a group of young boys looking to find an autograph from Richard. But just to get back to Plato's idea of justice, Plato believed that what we do, how we live, is dependent upon what we are suited for. So happiness occurs when one truly knows what he or she is fitted for, and also whether society or the state allows for the realization of its members' natures. So Plato divided the soul into three parts. There's reason, there's spirit, and there's desire. So Plato stated, and isn't it to produce justice, to establish the parts of the soul in a relation of mastery, and being mastered by one that is according to nature, while to produce injustice is to establish a relation of ruling, and being ruled by one another that is contrary to nature. So Plato believed that reason could rule the soul in a holistic manner. If reason rules the soul in a holistic manner, well, the reason would have wisdom, spirit would act with courage, and desire would act with temperance. Let's move on with Plato. And in truth, justice was, with respect to what is certain, what is within, with respect to what truly concerns him and his own. He doesn't let each part in him mind other people's business or the three classes in his soul meddle with each other, but really sets his own house in good order and rules himself. He arranges himself and becomes his own friend and harmonizes the three parts. So the key point to remember from this slide is that a just person is a person who puts his own house in order. So there is balance between reason, spirit, and desire. So what constitutes an unjust life and a just life? So let's look at how Plato described the democratic man. By doing battle, the democratic men, both sway themselves, naming shame, simplicity, they push it out with dishonor at the fugitive, calling moderation cowardliness and splattering it with mud, they banish it, persuading that measure and orderly expenditure are rustic and illiberal, joined with many useless desires in driving them over the frontier. Well, in this 1960 edition of Maclean's magazine, perhaps this is an example of democratic men, where these two guys brought in a TV set to the theater and decided to watch wrestling or boxing rather than the performance in front of them. So Plato perhaps would say that these men do not have any shame. So what constitutes a just life? But that is better for all to be ruled by what is divine and prudent, especially when one has it as his own within himself. But if not, set over one from outside, so that insofar as possible, all will be alike and friends, piloted by the same thing. So again, we're talking about the harmonized man or woman who is ruled by the divine, seeks wisdom, thinks of forms and what is good, and consequently, as Grant states, justice is the inward harmony which makes a self truly a self, or a soul truly a soul. Grant believed that in order to find the transcendental good, we must also be aware of what is good amongst us. So Grant stated, in human life, there must always be a place for love of the good and love of one's own. Love of the good is man's highest end. It is in the nature of things that we come to know and to love what is good by first meeting it in that which is our own. This particular body, this family, these friends, this woman, this part of the world, this set of traditions, this country, this civilization. So Grant believed that in order to love the transcendental, we must also be able to love or find something in our world to love. Well, Grant actually did find a place. It's Terrace Bay in Nova Scotia. And he had a cottage here, or a cabin. And eventually, when he died, he was buried in the vicinity of this region. Grant loved it, Terrace Cove, for its mystery and its holiness. So Grant always adored this place and tried to get back to it as often as he can. One important factor in philosophy is the will. And well, we can ask this question: what does the primacy of the will mean? Willing is that power of determining by which we put our stamp on events, including ourselves, in which we do some violence to the world. So the will is when we desire to act, when we strive to do something. When will is thought modernly, it means the resolute mastery of ourselves and the world. Will is the center of our aiming or seeking, holding together what we want. The greatest modern definer of will, Nietzsche, said that everything was will to power. But here's an example of will. It was the construction of the Canadian Railroad between 1881 and 1886. So at that time, it was considered an impressive feat of engineering and political will. First train to travel across the continent took almost 5 days to reach British Columbia. So let's sum things up. Grant believed that there are 3 primals, or 3 fundamental aspects to the Western tradition. One is derived from Jerusalem, the second from Athens, the third consists of human events. So I place this in this order because, again, Grant believed that religion should be predominant and philosophy should be subservient to religion. So from Jerusalem, we have Christianity, revelation, Christ, love, and charity. From Athens, we have Greek philosophy, divine order, Socrates, reason, and contemplation. And in human events, we will find the will, which represents the act of excluding given possibilities. It is the determination necessary to doing and acting, and it is the striving for and holding of power. So if we were to describe Grant, we would say that he is a Christian Platonist. Now, for this presentation, we will be stressing his understanding of philosophy. So, part 2, Hegelian optimism and the reassessment of technology. Now, part of this material is taken from Grant's book, Philosophy in the Mass Age, and his later book, Technology and Justice. Grant, according to William Christian, Grant's biographer, Grant thought that the Platonic order of an internal moral order was true. So Grant actually believed in Plato's idea of the forms. What he hoped to learn from Hegel was how this moral and metaphysical fact could be reconciled with the modern experience of subjective freedom. Hegel seemed to teach that the process of the unfolding of freedom was still taking place. So Grant was, you might say, a reluctant Hegelian. And in 1959, he wrote, "We in North America are at a stage where new and vital images have come from God to man, and I want to open myself to those images as they are given." Well, here's a edition of the Claims magazine from 1960, just a few years after Sputnik. It was a time when people had great interest in the stars, in astronomy, and in the heavens. So that begins his book, Philosophy in the Mass Age, with a description of mass society. Ours is the world of mass production and its techniques, of standardized consumption and standardized education, of wholesale entertainment and almost wholesale medicine. We are formed by this environment at all moments of our work and leisure. It is in our total lives. Here's a picture of a standardized kitchen. And well, it wasn't until the early 1950s that the kitchen that we have now came into being, where the range width was standardized with cupboards, the sinks, and the counters. And of course, in the kitchen, we'll find all sorts of technological devices. So Grant outlined the characteristics of a mass society. He stated it is scientific. It concentrates on the domination of man over nature through knowledge and its application. This dominance of man over nature means that we can satisfy more human needs with less work than ever before. Here we have a picture of the construction of the Toronto subway lines. And what we see here is the construction of the Yonge Street line, which opened in 1954. A second aspect of a mass society pertains to man's relationship to man. Grant wrote, it also exemplifies a particular relationship of man to man, namely some men's domination over other men. The paradox indeed is this: so great is the power that society can exert against the individual that he even subjects to dominance the very elites who seem to rule. So despite the nature of mass society, I believe that the characteristics of mass society will even keep the elites restrained or under control. The important concept that Grant considered was instrumental reason. So let's begin with a definition of instrumental reason. It's a specific mode of reasoning predicated on efficiency in terms of time, cost, and procedure to attain a certain end. So in this 1959 edition of Maclean's, you can see an example of instrumental reason at work, which is the construction of an outdoor swimming pool. So these are Grant's thoughts. What must be stressed is that reason itself is thought of simply as an instrument. It is to be used for the control of nature and the adjustment of the masses to what is required of them by the commercial society. This instrumentalist view of reason is itself one of the chief influences in making our society what it is. But equally, our society increasingly forces on its members this view of reason. So we can take two things from this. First of all, transcendental reason doesn't seem to be an important quality amongst many people. And secondly, instrumental reason is deeply pervasive. It is quality that surrounds us all the time. So is it possible to live a contemplative life in a mass society? So Grant was mulling over this question in his book. Such an account of reason, instrumental reason, goes so deep into the modern consciousness that any other account is very difficult for modern man to understand at all. Therefore, only by constant and relentless reflection on this modern idea can we hope to liberate ourselves from the naive acceptance of it. Yet, obviously, philosophic enterprise is only possible insofar as we have liberated ourselves from this view of reason. Well, it is very difficult to liberate ourselves from instrumental reason. Here in the 1963 catalog cover of Canadian Tire, we can see Dad reading the paper, and the headline states, "More leisure through automation." And then there's his daughter who's urging him on, more or less saying, "Come on, Dad, get to work. Let's do some useful activity. Let's enjoy ourselves. Let's be productive. And let's use our instrumental reason in cleaning up our yard and making it look very attractive." Nevertheless, Grant remained optimistic. Yet, as soon as one has considered the obstacles that society puts in the way of philosophic thought, one must assert the opposite and express optimism about the possibility of philosophy in our society. Whatever else the industrial civilization may have done, it has eliminated the excuse of scarcity. The conquest of nature by man through technology means human energy is liberated to attain objectives beyond those practically necessary. So here we have the Ross Building at York University. York University was established in 1959. Its first classes were held at the London College campus in 61, and the Keele Street campus opened in 1965. So there was a great demand for higher levels of education by the late 1950s, and that demand was met by the establishment of York University. Grant was critical of mass education in North America, but still he remained optimistic. They, referring to young people, are spiritually formed by the narrow practicality of techniques. They are immediately governed by ill-educated capitalists of narrow interest. But this very failure of our educational institutions is part of that alienation that will drive the best of our students to philosophy and theology. And these young people are the evidence that in our society, profound philosophical thought is arising. Here we can see an example of Hegelian dialectics of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. So that you might say that thesis is mass education, the antithesis is the alienation students suffer, and the synthesis might be the attainment of a higher level of reason. Grant wrote, they, the young people, herald what may be the dawn of the age of reason in North America. Now, he wrote this in 1959. In 1966, Grant had to reassess his understanding of Hegel and technology. So in the new preface of his book, Philosophy in the Mass Age, Grant wrote, the book is therefore permeated with the faith that human history, for all its pain and ambiguities, is somehow to be seen as a progressive incarnation of reason. What has been lost in the immediacy of the North American technological drive will be regained and regained at a higher level because of the leisure made possible by technology. Since that day, my mind has changed, wrote Grant. I am much less optimistic about the effects that a society dominated by technology has on the individuals that comprise it. I no longer believe that technology is simply a matter of means, which men can use well or badly. As an end in itself, it inhibits the pursuit of other ends in the society it controls. Thus, it's debasing our conceptions of human excellence. The one person who influenced Grant greatly was the German-American political philosopher Leo Strauss. Strauss taught at the University of Chicago. Grant met him twice, and Grant read all of his books. Upon reading Strauss's books, Grant abandoned his historical grounds for hope. He came to the conclusion that technology was leading mankind to a universal and homogeneous state, and this state will be a tyrannical state. Another person who influenced Grant greatly was a French sociologist by the name of Jacques Ellul, and his book, The Technological Society. So Grant frequently referred to this definition of technology. Grant wrote, referring to this definition, Ellul defines technique as the totality of methods rationally arrived at and having absolute efficiency for a given stage of development in every field of human activity. Technique is not limited to particular examples, of which the most obvious is machines. So Grant believed that Grant and Ellul both believe that a technological society attempts to integrate methods and devices in all aspects of society. It organizes and arranges society in a rational, systematic way, and subordinates man and nature to instrumental reason. Ellul wrote, technique integrates everything. It avoids shock and sensational events. It changes the arrangement of this blind world so that man can be a part of it without colliding with its rough edges, without the anguish of being delivered up to the human. So perhaps an example of this would be a modern suburb. So first modern suburb, first integrated comprehensive modern suburb built in Canada was constructed in Don Mills a suburb of Toronto in the 1950s. And this suburb is referred to as the mother of all suburbs found in Canada. So this pattern was already being constructed in the United States. And so in this suburb, we find an integrated system of roads, buildings, sewers, easements, and so on, which makes life, should make life fairly easy. A chapter in Elaw's book that Grant considered very important was the chapter pertaining to the autonomy of technique. So Elaw wrote, it was long claimed that technique was neutral. Today, that is no longer a useful distinction. Power and autonomy of technique are so well secured that it, in its turn, has become the judge of what is moral, the creator of a new morality. Thus, it plays the role of a creator of a new civilization as well. So Elaw believed that there are 4 principles of technique, and they include efficiency, mathematical precision, exactness of prediction, and the elimination of human variability. The first Tim Hortons to be opened up what was in Hamilton in 1964. And well, if we go to Tim Hortons, we'll see these principles of technique. We see efficiency through their drive-through orders. We see precision in the portions that we receive. We find predictability. So we know the product, the service, and the price will be the same. And there's control over people. There is a very deep division of labor within this restaurant. So Grant concluded that to live a contemplative life is to live a marginal life. Grant wrote, Western men live in a society, the public realm of which is dominated by a monolithic certainty about excellence, namely that the pursuit of technological efficiency is the chief purpose for which the community exists. So here we can find, on this cover of a Canadian Tire catalog, we can see the same group of people preparing their car for the fall and winter. And one thing you do is to change the wheels. You put on your winter tires. And that here is collecting his hunting equipment. Grant, you can ask this question: why are we unable to think about excellence aside from efficiency? Well, Elaw gave one explanation. These men, technique is in every way sacred. It is a common expression of human power without which they would find themselves poor, alone, naked, and stripped of all pretensions. They would no longer be heroes, which a motive permits them to be at little expense. Another reason Elaw gave was that if people criticize technology, they would suffer from a bad conscience. We know that there are benefits to technology, but at the same time, they may have reservations about technology. Elaw wrote, they find neither within nor without themselves a compensating force for what they call into question. Important philosopher who influenced George Grant was Martin Heidegger, and in particular, his essay, The Question Concerning Technology. I have no doubt at all that he is the great philosopher of the modern era. For myself, for instance, nobody has spoken so wonderfully about what technology is and seen it with such prodigious attention. Grant continued, I mean modern in the sense that there wasn't anything like what we call technology in the ancient world. There was technique and there were arts, but technology is essentially a modern phenomena, and it is to me the overwhelming phenomena. Here we have a windmill. It's found just to the west of Montreal. It was constructed in 1702. Still stands. Well, in this particular piece of technology, we do find tools, we do find devices, but they are all dependent upon nature. Windmill does not master or control nature. The windmill only operates if there is wind. Heidegger wrote about technology. Heidegger asks, what is modern technology? It is a revealing. The revealing that rules in modern technology is a challenging, which puts to nature the unreasonable demand that it supply energy that can be extracted and stored as such. What Heidegger means by this is that nature has to be challenged, called upon to reveal its use value, its hidden energy and power. It has to reveal its potential instrumentality. The setting upon that challenges forth the energies of nature, wrote Heidegger, is an expediting, and in two ways. It expedites in that it unlocks and exposes, yet that expediting is always itself directed from the beginning toward furthering something else, toward driving on to the maximum yield at the minimum expense. Here we have the Bruce nuclear generating station. It was first constructed in 1969. Well, in regards to nuclear energy, mankind has been able to reveal or unlock the energy stored in uranium and in plutonium. So consequently, man has at his disposal energy to sustain a nuclear chain reaction whenever he wishes. Two other concepts Heidegger considered very important was standing reserve and enframing. Standing reserve means everything is ordered to stand by, be immediately at hand. Indeed, to stand there just so that it may be on call for an ordering. So what Heidegger means by this is that all things that are considered an object, all things that are considered object must also act as a source of supply, must act as a resource that can be controlled for future use. And framing means the gathering together of that setting upon which sets upon man, challenge him for to reveal the real, in the mode of ordering as standing reserve. So what this means is that there is a tendency, an inclination, an attitude in us to question, to interrogate, to exploit nature, including man. We demand to know what is man's or nature's use value. So this work is therefore neither only a human activity nor a mere means within such activity. Man in the technological age is challenged forth into revealing. So we ourselves are challenged to challenge the world in order to interrogate it and to find its use value. So Grant believed that there is a new conception of what is just. The modern conception of goodness is of our free creating and greatness of life and all the advantages thereto. This presently popular phrase in the modern account is quality of life. Modern conception of goodness does not include the assertion of a claim upon us which properly orders our desires in terms of owning, and which is itself the root and fulfillment for desire. What Grant means by the latter quotation was that the appetites, our desires, are no longer obligated to abide by the rule of transcendental reason. Instead, technology encourages, draws, traps the appetites to demand an even further fulfillment of their hedonistic desires. So technology has become the ontology of the age. And Grant would agree, and Heidegger would agree on this point. We are free not only in what we want to make happen, but also choosing the means. The whole nature becomes more and more at our disposal, as if it were nothing in itself, but only raw material. So in 1985, Maclean's declared that Canada's forests were vanishing. We're just using as many of the trees as possible, and they are disappearing. Western peoples, and perhaps soon all peoples, take themselves as subjects confronting otherness as objects. Objects lying as raw material at the disposal of knowing and making subjects. So Grant also believed that it's not just nature that we exploit, it's also our fellow human beings that we treat as raw material and upon which we will use whenever we wish. So let's return to Grant's idea of justice. Human beings are fitted to live well together in communities and to try to think openly about the whole of nature. In living well together or being open to the whole in thought, we are fulfilling the purpose which is given to us in being human. So Grant would say that being human means an opportunity or ability to think in a cosmological sense. And the holding together in thought of our need and love of justice and demanding otherness is expressed by Plato when he writes of justice as a form. Justice is an unchanging measure of all our times and places, and our love of it defines us. Our desiring need of an unchanging good, which calls us to pay its price, is theoretically incongruent with what is thought in technology. So here we have a picture of Toronto in the early 1980s. And well, you want to put it this way. Humans have been swallowed by the whales of technology, and they are immersed, they are submerged in a sea of technology. And overlooking all this is the CN Tower, observing us as we go about our lives within a technological world. So in 1968, Grant wrote an essay in defense of North America. In this essay, he attempted to explain why our civilization is the way it is. So upon engaging with the Western continent, the Europeans encountered a new primal. So Grant wrote that America was not autochthonious. It was a place where Europeans could not automatically relate to or feel at home within. So Grant asked the question, why? Well, first of all, having crossed the Atlantic, Europeans gave up the old and settled. So they became dislodged, dislocated from their old way of life. It could not be ours in the old way because the making of it ours did not go back before the beginning of conscious memory. Here we have a map drawn by the French explorer Samuel de Champlain. And if you look closely at this map, what Champlain has done is he has penciled in, you might say, the location of various indigenous towns and villages and nations. So clearly, this is not terra nulla. This is an inhabited land and inhabited by a different group of people. And finally, in this continent, it could not be ours because the very intractability, immensity, and extremes of the new land required that its meeting with Western Europeans be a battle of subjugation. Important factor in the history of North America and Canada was the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century. Since the crossing of the ocean, we have been Europeans who were not Europeans. But the Europeanness which remained for us was a special kind because Calvinist Protestantism was itself a break in Europe, a turning away from the Greeks in the name of what was found in the Bible. So what Grant is saying is that Martin Luther and John Calvin believe that there can be no genuine philosophical theology. They believe that philosophy is not essential to theology. So that means excluding Plato and Aristotle. They believe that there is only the Bible and one's belief in divine providence. There was in the theology of the Calvinist Protestants a positive element which made it immensely open to empiricism and utilitarianism. So Protestants believe that humans were saved only by God's grace. So therefore, in the expectation of God's grace, what was expected was a stern standard of morality and hard work, which led to the Protestant work ethic and capitalism. So as the saying goes, God helps those who help themselves. So the first Presbyterian church built in the Canadas was built in Montreal in 1792. So Grant would say that Canadians are not exactly Europeans. For Europeans, Grant wrote, Athens was for them primal in the sense that in its perfected statements, educated Europeans found the way that things are. Plato and Aristotle presented contemplation as the height for man. But for those living in North America, because of the encounter of the land with the Protestants was primal for us, we never inherited much that was at the heart of Western Europe. It was also clear that the very nature of the primal for us, that we did not bring from your tradition of contemplation. So for people living in North America, in Canada, survival was very important, and that required an intense will, a pragmatic attitude, and a focus on what is practical. And there's little time for contemplation. Instead, you might say, worldly achievement was a sign of God's favor. So contemplation was not considered important. Good work was considered more important. To illustrate this, we can look at the Protestant merchants of Montreal. So the Canadian historian Donald Creighton wrote, born of lower middle class parents and brought up in an atmosphere of shrewd, hard, intelligently directed endeavor, they shared in that tough competition which is so characteristic of a feature of the 18th century middle class. The great majority of them were Protestants, but with few exceptions, they were neither enthusiasts nor fanatics, and they displayed little of the sternness of Presbyterian Scotland or the intolerance of Puritan New England. One example is Simon McTavish. He was the senior partner of the fur trading company, the Northwest Company, and Creighton wrote that this man personified money power and financial intellectualism. This McTavish was very shrewd and farsighted. He had very strong organizational and management skills. Another person, another Scotsman and Presbyterian, was James McGill, and he made his money through the fur trade, and eventually he left an endowment for the establishment of a university. A third person, not Scot, but English and Anglican, was John Molson. He established a brewery in Montreal in the 1780s. He became the president of Bank of Montreal. He financed steamships and railroad lines, and he established a hospital, hotel, and theater in Montreal. In the case of McTavish and McGill, they married French-Canadian women who were Catholics, while John Molson married a United Empire Loyalist woman. So what we have in Canada is the promised land, according to Grant. Indeed, the technological society is not for most North Americans, at least at the level of consciousness, a terra incognita, in which we must move with hesitation, moderation, and in wonder, but a comprehended promised land which we have discovered by the use of calculating reason, and which we can ever more completely inherit by the continued use of calculation. So an important Canadian economic historian is Harold A. Innes, and he wrote about staple commodities in Canada, and they included cod, fur, lumber, minerals, wheat, oil, and gas. Canada was a place rich in natural resources, those who wished to take them. So if one reads, for example, Innes's book, Fur Trade in Canada, what we will find is that the reader will be placed deeply within the technological experience. You will be a witness to the confrontation of technology and the mastery of land and nature. Grant believed then that in our preoccupation with doing, there is an absence of wonder. Perhaps we are lacking the recognition that our response to the whole should not most deeply be that of doing, that of wondering or marveling at what is or admiring it, and that such a stance as beyond all bargains and conveniences is the only source from which purposes may be manifest to us for necessary calculating. So Grant believed that we should revere, wonder, admire nature, and then afterwards to reconsider its instrumental use. So once Canada has been settled, we are now in the modern age. Grant wrote, now when Calvinism and the pioneer movement have both gone, the primal still shapes us. It shapes us above all as the omnipresence of that practicality which trusts in technology to create the rationalized kingdom of man. As moderns, we have no standards by which to judge particular techniques, except standards well enough with our faith in technological expansion. Here's a picture of the construction of Toronto City Hall in 1964. Right next to it is the old Registry of Deeds and Titles and Land Titles building. And as you notice, you'll see neoclassical columns in the front of this building. Well, I know within a year or so, the registry building, you might say that which was eternal, was destroyed, and what was replaced or what stood next to it was a very modern contemporary building. There's a deep interrelationship between technology and liberalism, Kant believed. What makes the drive to technology so strong is that it is carried on by men who still identify what they are doing with the liberation of mankind. So many people believe that with technology, good could be done. And it's important that research be continued. Grant continued, if all men are to become free and equal within the enormous institutions necessary to technology, then the overcoming of chance must be more and more rigorously pursued and applied. One example of this was the establishment of universal Medicare by Prime Minister Lester Pearson in 1966, which made medical assistance relatively inexpensive for all Canadians. Are consequences for the absence of a contemplated tradition. Indeed, until recently, the very absence of a contemplated tradition spared us the full weight of that public nihilism which in Europe followed with industrial society. We took our society pragmatically as if its effect on us could be limited to the external. Thus, it was possible for us to move deeply into the technological society while maintaining our optimism and innocence. So without a contemplated tradition, Grant believed, we do not have extremes in political thought. What we have is a certain degree of naivety and optimism amongst Canadians. And so here's a picture of Expo 67, which was a celebration of Canada's 100th birthday. And the Canadian Pavilion is the inverted pyramid that you see in the background. So we are left with pure will to technology. Grant stated that religion is no longer important. Contemplative philosophy is absent from our lives. So Grant wrote, for those who stay within the central stream of our society and are therefore dominant of its institutions, the effect of nihilism is the narrowing to an unmitigated reliance on technique. So all that we are left with in this nihilistic world is our reliance on technique. What that phrase, the end of ideology, flatteringly covers is the closing down of willing to all content except the desire to make the future by mastery, and a closing down of all thinking which transcends calculation. So we don't really think transcendentally, we think in an instrumental way. Yet the very substance of our existing, which has made us the leaders in technique, stands as a barrier to any thinking which might be able to comprehend technique from beyond its own dynamism. We are so embedded within a technological world that we are no longer able to understand how we live. So in this photograph, you see a picture of first Canadian place. It's the global headquarters for the Bank in Montreal, and Manulife Financial Corporation is the majority shareholder of this building. So the last part of this presentation will attempt to answer this question: what is worth doing in the midst of this barren twilight? And it comes from Grant's essay, Platitude. Now, a platitude is a commonplace remark that is solemnly delivered. The essence of humanity. Grant wrote, "We hold in our minds the enormous benefits of technological society, but we cannot so easily hold the ways it may have deprived us, because technique is ourselves. Technique comes forth from and sustained in our vision of ourselves as creative freedom, making ourselves and conquering the chances of an indifferent world." So here in this painting by Alex Colville, road work, we can see where humans are at one with technique. For example, the man holding the sign, and also the man driving the roller is an extension of that machine. We also see the conquest of nature with the construction of the road. Then we see standing reserve, the Heidegger's concept, and that includes the land, humans, machine, and eventually the road, all have use value. Grant couldn't deny the fact that there are benefits to technology. For it is clear that the systematic interference with chance was not simply undertaken for its own sake, but for the realization of freedom. Indeed, it was undertaken partly in the name of that charity which was held at the height in one of those ancient systems of meaning. So here he's referring to Christianity. In this painting by Colville, we see a woman, a surveyor, looking over the shore, and well, we can apply Heidegger's concept of framing to this painting. So the world is set before this woman, and this woman is, in a sense, questioning, interrogating, exploiting, and ordering the landscape she sees before her. Well, we can ask this question: what do we do then with our freedom? In myth, wrote Grant, philosophy, and revelation, orders were proclaimed in terms of which freedom was measured and defined. As freedom is the highest term in a modern language, it can no longer be enfolded. So what Grant is saying here is that once myth, philosophy, and revelation restricted our freedom, but with the demise of myth, philosophy, and revelation, we have freedom and we have the ability to do, in a sense, whatever we want. So how do we know what is worth doing with our freedom? There is no possibility of answering the question. Freedom for what purposes? Such may indeed be the true account of the human situation, an unlimited freedom to make the world as we want in a universe indifferent to what purpose we choose. If our situation is such, then we do not have a system of meaning. So if we refer to Nietzsche, who said that God is dead, then our universe is meaningless. We ask this question: what do we do with our freedom? In Colville's painting, Pacific, we are confronted by a moral dilemma. What must we do with our power? So in this painting, we see a World War II service revolver and Colville's mother's sewing table. The gun is placed on the ruler, and the ruler acts as a standard. And so this painting symbolizes justice. There is balance. The threat of violence is controlled by peaceful order. And in this particular case, the man is looking off towards nature onto the ocean. There is a world of silence. All coherent languages, mythical, philosophical, religious, beyond those which serve the drive to unlimited freedom through technique, have been broken up in the coming to be of what we are. So myth, philosophy, and religion Grant believed, no longer can speak to us. It really has no value other than as artifacts of a museum culture. Therefore, it is impossible to articulate publicly any suggestion of loss, and perhaps even more frighteningly, almost impossible to articulate it to ourselves. We have been left with no words which plead together and summon out of uncertainty, the good of which we may sense the dispossession. So in this calendar painting by Colville, we see a crow flying over a road. And in Colville's world, crows symbolize doom. They carry the threat of the unseen. You can ask this question: do they sense something dead or dying below in our empty world where there's nothing to say? Grant still calls on us to remember what was once good. Only in listening for the intimidations of the primal can we live critically in the dynamo. So we need to listen and listen very closely to what we may be missing. Language of good is not then dead language, but one that must, even in its present disintegration, be recollected, even as we publicly let our freedom become ever more increasingly the pure will to will. So in this particular painting, entitled Ocean Limited, and Ocean Limited does refer to a train line that travels from Halifax to Montreal. We see a man, maybe Colville, who is thinking, walking along one route in one direction, and a train moving in the opposite direction on a separate medium. Now, trains in Colville's world imply war and destruction. In this painting, we see a man perhaps contemplating, but there's balance here between the contemplated person and the machine. So also each has a role or place to play in our world. So how should we live? In such a situation of uncertainty, it will be lacking in courage to turn one's face to the wall, even if one can find no fulfillment in working for or celebrating the dynamo. So Grant's saying, and he's referring to Plato's allegory of the cave, do not turn to the wall. You have to face the world. Equally, it will be immoderate and uncourageous and perhaps unwise to live in the midst of our present drive, merely working in it and celebrating it, and not also listening or watching or simply waiting for intimations of the primal, which might lead us to see the beautiful as the image in the world of the good. So what Grant is doing in this essay is, in a sense, practicing negative theology. And so what he's asking us to do is this: the job of thought at our time is to bring into light that darkness which is darkness. Or another way, the role of thought is to bring the darkness into light as darkness. So Grant would say that we still have to revere what was important in the past, such as books like written by Plato or Aristotle, but we should also listen for what we may have lost. And by listening and thinking and looking for what we may have lost, we may once again find it. George Grant and Alex Colville admired each other. And Grant wrote a book, English Speaking Justice, and he dedicated that book to Alice Colville and to a Toronto poet, Dennis Lee. And Grant wrote, "These are two artists who have taught me about justice." So Grant, though he's a Platonic thinker, still believed that we can gain an insight into the transcendental good through art. Grant received a number of awards, honorary degrees, and he was made made an officer of the Order of Canada. And here's the bibliography: primary sources by Grant, secondary sources, and Grant's role in the Neoplatonic tradition, and other works that were referred to in order to put this presentation together. Thank you very much.